It's an honor to be a part of this great program, and I think you're in for a real treat today. I think you're going to meet three people who have played a significant part in events that changed the world and changed history. So I'm going to introduce them first and give them a good welcome, and then I will tell you a little bit more about them. So please welcome Clint Hill, Vern Pike, and Jim Leavelle. While we're getting settled, I will just say to you that to be in this place in the National Archives with these three history makers is quite appropriate. And I think what I will do is tell you a little bit about each one of them, and then I will join them and ask them some questions. But I think I'd like to give you a chance to ask some questions of these three men. So I'm going to introduce, not in any particular order of age, they can all tell you how old they are, but they all have a great connection to military service, but also to history. James Robert Leavelle is immediately to my right. Was born and raised in Red River, Texas. He served in the United States Navy during World War II. And he was a sailor on board the USS Whitney at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. He also later was a Dallas, Texas homicide detective, a member of an elite group that was called the Cracker Jacks, and he was escorting Lee Harvey Oswald through the basement of the Dallas police headquarters when Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. Several photographs, including one that won a Pulitzer Prize, were taken of Oswald just before and as Ruby pulled the trigger, and Jim Leavelle is in that picture. You would recognize him in the tan suit and the tan hat. Those articles of clothing are in the sixth floor museum in Dallas, Texas. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but I encourage you to visit. Clint Hill, immediately to Mr. Leavelle's right, served in the U.S. Secret Service from 1958 to 1975. He was also an enlisted man in the U.S. Army. After leaving the Army, he went to the Secret Service. He protected the presidency through 5 administrations: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. On November 22nd, 1963, Special Agent Hill was in the motorcade in Dallas, Texas, assigned to protect First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. As shots were fired on the motorcade, Hill ran from his position on the running board of the follow-up car and leaped into the back seat of the presidential limousine to protect Mrs. Kennedy from any further shots. He was credited with saving Jacqueline Kennedy's life, and he received the nation's highest civilian award for bravery. He authored several books, all of which were on the New York Times bestseller list, including Mrs. Kennedy and Me. Vern Pike, immediately to Mr. Hill's right, is a retired Army colonel and businessman. After graduating from Wake Forest University, he entered the Army and served for 30 years, retiring in 1988. During Colonel Pike's extensive Army career, he served in Berlin as first officer in charge at Checkpoint Charlie, the night the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. He participated in the exchange of Gary Powers and Colonel Abel in 1962 in Berlin, served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Later, he was assistant professor of international relations at the U.S. Military Academy and commanded a battalion and later a brigade in Germany. So before we begin with my questions, I'd like you to all give these three history makers a round of applause. Now I'm going to ask first Mr. Leavelle a question that many people many people want to know about that incident. Of course, in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters. Did you know Jack Ruby before this time?
Oh yes, I had known him for quite a while. He
How?
was well known to most of the officers.
So when you saw him there that day, did it surprise you?
Well, it surprised me that he was down in the basement because everybody had been excluded from that except some of the people who was involved in it. And of course, a truckload of reporters that was in there. When I first saw him, as I approached with Oswald, he was standing about a little over halfway back in the group of people, and he had a pistol in his left hand, and he's holding it tight against his leg like this to cover it up. And with all of the reporters and police officers standing around, and nobody had noticed that. But in my police career, I'd already made a habit of when I went into a room where there were people that I didn't know, I smoked them over real good, that's one of the first things I saw was him with that pistol, and I recognized him, and I knew exactly what was on his mind. But I was within a few feet of him, and I made a move to get to him. But by that time he had come forward. I reached over and got him by the shoulder, but he was already in the act of pulling the trigger. The bullet was fired and hit Oswald right about here, but I was pulling him behind me at the time. And after that shot, he was continuing to pull the trigger, and I had jerked Oswald back and hiding him behind me, and he was trying to get to him. By that time, the pistol was pointed at me right along here, and he was pulling the trigger, but my partner on the other side had reached over and grabbed the pistol by the cylinder, and when I saw that, I knew he wasn't going to turn it loose, and I knew it wasn't going to fire as long as he was holding it. And if it hadn't been for that, I wouldn't be here today, because he'd got in 2 shots that hit me right in here the same way.
So you were also shot?
Do what?
You were shot as well?
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
I was not.
Right.
But
Right.
What I said was, if my partner hadn't grabbed that pistol,
yes.
well, he grabbed his wrist with one hand and the pistol with the other.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, I breathed a lot easier because I knew my partner and I knew he would not turn loose of that. And so then I went ahead and pulling and getting my prisoner out of harm's way.
Yeah. And then you went with Oswald to the hospital, didn't you?
Oh yes, I did.
And you told me a story about the nurse at the hospital marking the pistol?
No, she marked it. But
Not the pistol, the bullet, I'm sorry.
Well, bullet, yes. Well, see, that bullet was evidence. And when I examined him inside, the bullet went in here, and so I was looking for the bullet in his back, but it cut, well, it gone through a couple of other arteries, and it hit the 7th rib on the back side, and when it did, it turned the bullet in a different direction. It ended up right over here on this side, wow. just under the skin. So when I checked it, I could roll it around underneath the skin.
Wow.
And of course, that's evidence. That bullet is evidence. So when I got him to the hospital, and the doctors was all ready to go because they had called in advance, and he reached over and grabbed the gurney and tried to pull it in. I said, "Wait just a minute. I want that bullet out of him before you pull him in there." So he stopped and took his scalpel and just picked it up and whacked it. And I had given the nurse a little saucer-like deal that was sitting there, and he just dumped that into that little container, and he went on, pulled on in and started working on it, but I cleaned the bullet off, got the blood off of it, and reached in my pocket and got my pocket knife. I had a real sharp bladed pocket knife at that time, and I gave it to the nurse, and I told her, I said, scratch your initial inside of this bullet because it will be evidence somewhere down the line, but under the circumstances, I won't begin to guess how long it might be. And so she put an A in the middle of it, and her name was Audrey or something like that. And I did testify, I think, about 3 different times on that down the line, and I know she did at least once. But I had her name on there because she was to identify her initial, that she wrote the initial on there.
Well, I might want to come back and ask you about Pearl Harbor in a minute, but I want to ask Mr. Hill. You're interviewed so much and you've written so much about this event, the assassination of President Kennedy. What's the question that you wish people would ask you that you're not asked about this event, or that you think they should know that they don't really ask enough?
Well, they get so much conspiracy information that they ask questions that are really rather ridiculous at times. But you know, there's really not a question that I wish they'd ask. I wish they'd stop asking questions, period. But because I've answered, I think, almost every question possible, including appearing before the Warren Commission and other things of that nature. So I couldn't tell you what the question would be that I wish they would ask.
Well, the question that I've thought about, and people do ask, is that moment when the photo that we have of Mrs. Kennedy leaving the car. What was that? What can you tell us about that? And what was that all about?
Well, that occurred just after the 3rd shot had been fired, and that was the shot that hit President Kennedy. His head had gone down like this against Mrs. Kennedy's cheek, and the bullet entered back here, but it exited up here above the ear, and it just took part of the scalp out, and material erupted out of that wound, blood, brain matter, bone fragments. And so I was getting up on the car, and she started up out of her seat onto the trunk. She was trying to retrieve some of that material.
Wow.
And she did manage to get some of it in her hand.
Wow.
And then I got a hold of her, and I put her in the back seat.
Wow.
So then the president's body fell to its left, and his head ended up in her lap. But that was what she was trying to do, was retrieve material.
And you continued to serve as her Secret Service, you assigned to her even after the assassination?
They had me stay with her for an additional year. I stayed with her until November of 1964. Then I was sent back to the White House and assigned to President Johnson.
So what was it like to work with her?
Oh, she was a wonderful person to work with, very cooperative for me. She trusted me, and so we had a great relationship. She had me do a lot of things that agents don't normally do. I had a very good relationship with the president. Whenever we would be out of town, for example, we'd be in New York, and she would want to do something. I recall one time she wanted to go visit former President Truman and his wife were visiting in New York at the same time, so she wanted to go see them. So I said, well, we better clear that with the president, with the White House. So I called the president's office, and his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, answered the phone, and I told Evelyn what the problem was, and she said, oh, just a minute. So she put me on hold, and next thing I know, I'm talking to the president, as usual, and he's telling me what he wants her to do and not to do. And in this case, he didn't want us to go see the Trumans because there was something developing, and he didn't want that to interfere, so we didn't, and I had to explain that to her. But that was typical.
Yes. Yeah. I think that people don't realize the role the Secret Service plays in being becoming a part of the family in so many ways. And you served 5 different presidents, so what was that like? How do you make that transition, and knowing the personality and the sort of the people around the president, that's got to be a real challenge.
It is. The transition is a real challenge. For example, going from Eisenhower, who when he left office in January 1961 was 70 years of age, to a 43-year-old former senator who had a 3-year-old daughter and whose wife was waiting to deliver a new baby at any moment. I mean, we knew everything, you know, all the activity level was going to be completely different with the Kennedys than it was with the Eisenhowers.
Yeah.
And that's typical of every administration.
Yeah.
When they change, the personalities change. The only thing that remains constant is the ego, which that has to be there for them to do what they strive to do by acquiring that position in life. It takes a gigantic ego.
Colonel Pike, a lot of people in this audience may not, they probably heard about the Kennedy assassination. They may not know as much about the Berlin Wall. And you were there when the Berlin Wall was being built. What was that like? Was that a surprise to you, or how close were we to war at that point with the Soviet Union? This is 1961. Right?
On the 8th of May of 1945, Germany surrendered to the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the United States. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation. In 1956, the Western powers, France, Great Britain, and the United States, were instrumental in the creation of the new Federal Republic of Germany, and the Soviets created the Soviet zone of occupation, which became the German Democratic Republic. The capital of Germany was 110 miles behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet zone of occupation, and the city itself was divided into 4 sectors: Soviet, British, French, and American. The spring and summer of 1961, East Germany was under a famine situation. Food was difficult. And if someone wanted to walk across the street and go to freedom, that's all they had to do. Come to Berlin, walk across the street to be a free person. The exodus of tens of thousands of East Germans was creating a crisis for the communist regime. And so on the night of the 12th of August of 1961, they began construction of a barricade, which at first was barbed wire and was later replaced with cinder blocks and then later generations of heavy construction. The East Germans decided sometime after the wall went up that they wanted to exercise their authority over all people entering the Soviet sector of Berlin. The Allied agreements at the end of World War II said, as long as we occupy Germany, we will deal with ourselves, but we will not deal with the Germans. And so the communist guards began a series of stopping American vehicles. President Kennedy sent General Lucius Clay, the hero of the Berlin airlift, 1948-49, back to Berlin in August of '61 as his personal representative. Clay it was a difficult situation. We will not deal with the East Berlin communists. We will only deal with the Soviets. And so we were told to go tell the East Germans, knock it off, or there's going to be trouble. They did not knock it off. So General Clay directed that our young military police alert squad, 12 soldiers, 18-year-old draftees, led by an acting sergeant, we were going to escort one of our civilian vehicles into the Soviet sector of Berlin. Now, in the modern military, you're going to be shocked when I tell you what the rules of engagement were for those young 18-year-old MPs. You have a brand new M14 rifle, you have a magazine in the weapon, a round in the chamber, safety off, bayonet unsheathed. If anyone tries to stop you, shoot them. We did that 14 times. And the 15th time, a group of tanks from the Soviet sector came towards Checkpoint Charlie. I was there with the tank company commander. We had been sending 2 or 3 tanks down to the Checkpoint Charlie area to reinforce the MPs as they went across with this armed escort into the communist sector. They had just sent the tanks back to Tempelhof Air Base, and Major Tyree was the tank company commander standing next to me, and we saw these tanks coming. He said, "Vern, go get my tanks." So Friday afternoon, 4:30, Berlin rush hour, back we go. We bring the tanks back to Checkpoint Charlie. Now these other tanks are there. T-54 tanks. The bumper markings had been erased. There was no way to tell who they were. The soldiers had uniforms with no insignia of rank or unit. Psychological warfare. We didn't know who they were. So by now my boss was down there, the provost marshal. General Clay says to Colonel Sabalik, I want to know whether they're Soviet or East German tanks. If they're East German tanks, we go to war. Colonel Sabalik turned to me and said, Vern, go over to East Berlin and identify the tanks. 25-year-old lieutenant, absolutely. Get in the car and off we go. We get in behind the tanks. There's nobody around. I walked around. There were 11 tanks, 2 columns of 5 each, and a lead tank in the middle and the front. Walked around the tank in the back, no bumper markings. But what does a 25-year-old lieutenant do? To obey your orders. So I climbed up the tank. I went down inside the tank, and there was Cyrillic script on the instrument panel, and the driver was nice enough to leave a Red Army newspaper by the brake handle. So I grabbed the newspaper, climbed out of the tank, and then I saw there were a bunch of soldiers up behind the lead tank. So I grabbed my driver and says, let's go attend the briefing. And we went up there, and they were speaking Russian, and whoever, I don't know what his rank was because there was no rank visible, but he was speaking Russian, and he looked up and he sees these 2 American MPs. I said, let's get the hell out of here. So we got in our vehicle and went back to Checkpoint Charlie, and my colonel said, whose tanks are they? And I told him, he said, you did what? And I said, sir, those are my orders. Here's a Red Army newspaper. So he gave me the telephone. He said, you tell General Clay, which I did. I tell you this, the point of this story is that General Clay, a man that we all, those of us that served there, admired him for his guts, knew that the Soviets weren't going to do anything to go to war or anything like that. But they brought those tanks up to demonstrate that they were responsible for the security of their sector like we were for ours. And that avoided a big crisis.
So that was a signal to the Germans, probably.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask 3 of you one more question, then we'll open it up. I always feel that history is a resource that helps us understand our own times. The reason we study history is partly, well, just because there are great stories as we've just heard, but it's also a way to understand who we are today. So I'm going to start with Colonel Pike. Just one sentence or two. How is your experience that you just described and that whole Berlin experience help us understand our own times today?
Oh, that's very easy. That's very easy to respond to. When you see a 77-year-old woman hanging from a bedsheet on the 7th story of an apartment building to drop into West Berlin to be free, you understand what freedom is all about. It's not free. And when you see that, it changes you forever. We're spoiled in this country. We take freedom for granted. Most other lands in this world don't understand what we have. And I hope that you all will understand what the price of freedom is, like my compatriots here have experienced.
Clint, Mr. Hill, any lessons learned, or what's the relevance of what you went through in that terrible time?
Well, we learned that an assassination of a president can happen at any time, at any place, under any kind of conditions. You never know for sure what's going to happen, and you always must be prepared. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that you learn from history, and hopefully that future generations will understand that the dedication it takes to always be prepared and ready to do whatever is necessary to protect the office of the presidency, no matter who the occupant may be.
Mr. Leavelle, any lessons learned from what you, either Pearl Harbor or you're sort of the Forrest Gump of this conference here. You've been everywhere. You've been the president of Pearl Harbor and in Dallas, two events that changed world history. Any lessons learned from this for you?
Sure. Check where you're going. And you never know where you're going to be, and you never know exactly what's going to happen to you. Just like the shooting at the basement. In my police work, I come close 3 or 4 times being shot. One bullet went right under my chin, powder burned me. But when I went to work that day, I didn't expect nothing like that to happen. So you never know what's going to happen, and you should be alert to where you are and what's going on. But that's about the best thing I can tell you. But I think the man upstairs was looking after me a few times, and I try to thank him every once in a while. He hasn't answered me yet, but I'm not too far away, so we'll see.
What about questions from the audience? Anyone? Yes, sir. You, yes.
Sorry, Mr. Hill, this one's for you. But
Mike's coming to you.
Mr. Hill, this one is for you. But working for the Secret Service in 5 different presidencies, what were some of the biggest changes that you saw in the presidential position? And do you think they positively or negatively impacted the position itself?
I'll repeat it.
Well, as far as the Secret Service is concerned, the biggest changes we had was the change after the assassination in 1963. The organization itself was completely reorganized. I mean, everything was changed, from numbers of personnel available to type of training. And so it was a big change. Insofar as the office itself, it hasn't changed hardly at all. It changes leadership, the occupant changes, and they have different theories, different philosophies. But once they get into the office and get settled down, usually over a period of time, it's pretty similar continuously, which is the way I guess it should be. Continuity.
Is the Secret Service responsible for counterfeiting, for
Yes.
for spot? How did that come to be part of the Secret Service?
Well, that was how the Secret Service was initially formed in 1865. In April of 1865, President Lincoln had a meeting with the Secretary of the Treasury because the number of counterfeit currency being passed in the United States was so large that the value of the dollar was being diminished. So they decided to create an organization to combat counterfeiting. It would have been signed shortly thereafter, but unfortunately that night, President Lincoln decided to go to theater with his wife. They went to Ford's Theater and he was assassinated.
Right up the street here.
Right up the street. So the organization of the Secret Service was delayed until July 5th of 1865. And then when it was created for that reason. It had nothing to do with presidential protection. It had everything to do with counterfeiting, forgery, and today it's cybercrime, identity theft, credit card fraud. All of that type of thing is handled by the Secret Service. They have one of the best cyber units in the government.
I know at the Smithsonian, when we've had some, we have a very extensive coin and currency collection, and every once in a while something's presented to us at the Smithsonian as being authentic, and we always consult with the Secret Service to help us, or sometimes they consult with us.
Oh, sure.
To document. Other questions?
Got time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask one of them.
All right. Well, you're the chairman, so.
To tie all 3 of these men together, Colonel Pike, I understand that you have played a role tandem to the assassination of President Kennedy. We got a call on the 22nd of November to proceed to Andrews Air Force Base. I was then assigned to the Armed Forces Police Detachment in Washington, D.C., and we were tasked by Military District of Washington Special Events to provide security escorts when requested. So we went to Andrews Air Force Base, took the remains to Bethesda Naval Hospital, secured the operating room up there. They didn't have a morgue in the hospital, so they used the operating room. The press gave the commandant of the hospital such a rough time that at 1 o'clock in the morning, he had a second ambulance that he made available, and we put the remains in the second ambulance and escaped out the back trash entrance to the hospital and circumvented the emergency room entrance and went down to Gawler's Funeral Home.
Well, now, I think there's a little different recollection there, and this is interesting in terms of, I'm an oral historian, so Clint, do you want to Well, you were there at the scene too, so
Yeah.
what do you remember?
Well, what I remember, and I was with Mrs. Kennedy and the remains all the time, I was called down to where the autopsy was being taken place. I was up on the 17th floor with Mrs. Kennedy. We had placed her in a suite where she and members of her family could wait for the autopsy to end, because we got there about, I don't know, early that evening, around 7, and we didn't get out of there until about 4 in the morning. So I went down to the autopsy room. It was about 2 in the morning after they had finished the autopsy, because they wanted me to see and have the doctors explain what the exact wounds were, so that if Mrs. Kennedy had any questions, she would have someone to ask, and I was a logical person since I was with her all the time. And then we had damaged the casket when we tried to put it on board Air Force One in Dallas. It was too large to go through the door of Air Force One. They put it up on the rear of the Air Force One in the back door, and we couldn't get it through until we broke the handles off the casket. So when they got to Bethesda, they had to have Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell, two of Kennedy's top staff, go to Goller's and buy a brand new casket, which they brought back to Bethesda, and they put the remains in that, and we took it to the White House and got to the White House about a little after 4 a.m.
Wow. Last question.
No, actually, I'm just advised that we have a little more time than I thought, so we'll take a couple more questions.
Okay, and I'll handle the questions.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Another question. I'm looking around here.
Well, we're ready to go.
Anyone? Yes, please, raise your hand. Higher, yeah, thank you. Stand up.
Get a mic to him.
This question is for Colonel Pike. As someone who was there when the Berlin Wall was being built, what was it like when you finally heard the news that it was being torn down? Did you ever think that you were going to see the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of this stalemate that had been going on for almost 30 years at this point?
Thank God it's over. It was a nightmare.
Were you surprised that it came down?
No, I wasn't surprised, because totalitarian dictatorships can't last forever.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a wonderful example of just how useless that whole system is. And it came down not by force, it came down by what we called the velvet hammer. And it just fell of its own accord. And the system went out of existence. Thank God.
Yeah. Other hands that I've missed?
Lady over here.
Yes, ma'am. Get her a microphone.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm Dr. Vivian Worsel. I am an audiologist, so everyone should hear me well. I'm with Arlington Gold Star Wives and also public relations with Gold Star Wives. My question's to Mr. Hill, and this is maybe a little bit on the personal side, the family side, sir, but that was very traumatic, your experience with the assassination. How did you handle it? Did you have a family at that time? And my disclaimer is, I did Google you and will buy your book on Amazon.
So I can't fake it, huh? I was married. I had 2 sons. I was gone about 90% of the time when I was on a detail, because of I did an awful lot of advance work. The assassination itself caused me a great deal of difficulty emotionally. I was brought up by a family that when you were given the responsibility of a job, you carried it out to the final conclusion, no matter what it cost you or how difficult it was. And in this case, we weren't able to protect the president, and I felt personally guilty. And it really started to affect me. And over a period of years, we had no counseling at all. We just all had to continue on, go right back to work. There was no counseling. We didn't see anybody. We never talked about it amongst ourselves. We never talked about it with our families. And so it just ate at us. started to deteriorate physically because of that. By 1975, during the time that I was assistant director at that time for all protective forces, I had to take a physical exam at Bethesda, and I took it, and the doctors came to me afterwards and said, Mr. Hill, we're sorry to tell you this, but the Secret Service is going to have to retire you because you no longer can qualify physically. And it was a shock to me, but that's how serious I had taken it, and that's what happened to me. And when that happened, from that point on, beginning about 1976, I went into a very deep depression. I secluded myself away from friends and family, and that lasted for a period of 6 years until a doctor friend of mine came to see me and said, look, you know, if you keep this up, you'll be dead shortly. So I changed everything I was doing, and I started to get better. But I wasn't really better until about 2009, I met a young lady named Lisa McCubbin, who was writing a book for a friend of mine, and I helped in that book, and then they convinced me to write a book that I had vowed I'd never write, and I found that really did help me. Cathartic, it was great for me to talk about what had happened, put it in writing, and get it out, because that's what happens when you have PTSD. You have to talk about it, you have to get it out. I went back and visited the site there in Dealey Plaza, and all of that really helped me a great deal. But the marriage, it didn't make it, and the 2 sons I have and I were closer now than ever, but it was a difficult period of time.
Any other questions? Sir. Wait, I'm sorry. Oh, here, yes.
Thank you, sir. You know, it occurred to me this picture on the left on the limousine was on Friday, midday. In chaos that night, the whole country was let out of school and off of work. And then Saturday, the whole country mourned and didn't know what to do. And it was just a kind of a commentary on what happened. And everybody was kind of just still. And then with Mr. Leavelle and the jail and everything was on Sunday. And then on Monday, the president was put into the ground and we had a new president. And it's just phenomenal, those 72 hours that this country just kind of all went the same way and maintained a unity in the transition of power and the mourning and personal and professional and as a country. And so there's really no question. It's just a commentary that is phenomenal the way it happened. So thanks for your participation in all of it.
Yeah, I do. I see a lot of young faces in here. I want to make sure I give them a chance. Anybody have any questions? I do see one other question here in the back. Yes.
I just wanted to make a follow-up comment, context of the group that's here. 2 weeks after the assassination, it was the Army-Navy game. President Johnson canceled the game, and Jackie said no. He was in the Navy. He said, "That's Jack's game. Let it go." And Staubach put a certain beat Army tape on his hat, and they went forward and had the game. And I think that was really important in healing and bringing the nation back, that he was a football fan, and I think it was very important that she did that.
Well, I think the message of continuity, unity, but also service is very clear in what we've heard here today. So again, join me in thanking Mr. Leavelle, Clint Hill, Vern Pike,